Hello and welcome to another TLDR US video. After a bit of struggle, a couple weeks back, Joe Biden was eventually able to pass his promised $1.9 trillion pandemic stimulus package to get the US up and running again after a truly dreadful year of COVID-19. For all the talk of unity, however, Senate Democrats were forced to use a parliamentary tool known as budget reconciliation, which only needs 51 votes to actually get the measures into law. Without resorting to reconciliation, ironically named considering it doesn't require reaching across the aisle, this bill wouldn't have passed in its current form. Why? Well, that's because of the filibuster. You've probably heard it mentioned a lot before, so in this video we're going to discuss where the filibuster comes from, how it's been used in the past, and if there's any chance of it being removed from Senate life. If you haven't already, consider subscribing to the channel and ringing the bell to make sure that you never miss one of our TLDR US videos, and help us get slightly closer to 200,000 subscribers. Thanks so much for your support. Now, some of you unfamiliar with the filibuster may fairly enough assume that it just refers to stopping a bill by senators standing up and talking for hours. However, there is a difference between this, the traditional filibuster, and the filibuster rule. Even without someone standing up and talking for hours, it basically means that for most bills to successfully get through the Senate, a supermajority of 60 votes is needed. Which means that even if a party has a solid majority, its leadership is, most of the time, still going to need to reach across the aisle. Because of this, recently there have been increasing calls, especially from parts of the Democratic Party, to remove the filibuster. Just to be clear, this is generally not a party political thing. Whoever has the majority at a given time is frustrated by the filibuster, but usually put off reform by the prospects of what happens if things switch and they end up being the minority. The current argument boils down to the fact that the filibuster prevents significant legislation from ever being passed and helping Americans. We'll shortly come to the potential for reform and what it might look like, but let's quickly dive into the filibuster's history. So, the filibuster hasn't actually always been in place, but how did it begin? As some of you may know, the filibuster rule is nowhere to be seen in the Constitution. The rule itself was created in 1917, and at that point, up until 1975 when it was reduced to 60 senators, you needed the support of 67 members to get on with most legislation. The United States Senate is thought of as the deliberative chamber of detailed debate, and many argue that the filibuster protects that function. Without it, they say, there would effectively just be two houses of representatives, where majority rules. While it's easy to appreciate that in an ideal world that's exactly how it would function, enhancing the democratic process, the filibuster rule has a very cynical and sinister history, being used in ways that threaten basic human rights. The filibuster rule is a legacy of the Jim Crow era, and both the actual talking filibuster and the 60 or 67 vote rule have been used to directly get in the way of civil rights legislation. After all, the tool was used to prevent anti-lynching legislation, and the leader of the Southern Democrats spoke for 24 hours in an attempt to stop the 1957 Civil Rights Act from going through. He and his colleagues also did so in 1964 to hold up the Civil Rights Act that year too. The filibuster isn't just used against major civil rights stuff though, but all kinds of bills. But you can understand why people have major issues with it when looking at its history. But that's not the only problem. What about the massive proliferation in recent years? The rise in the number of cloture motions used is seen as the best way of judging this. Cloture motions are filed in order to end a filibuster. In other words, they are the actual thing that needs 60 votes. Although it's an imperfect way of seeing whether the use of the filibuster has actually increased, due to the fact that the bill is often not even brought to a debate if it's obviously going to fail, but as I say, it's the best method we have. Take this handy graph produced by The Economist, showing how obviously the prevalence of the filibuster has shot up recently. You don't need to be an expert data scientist to see that something's changed here. So while various arguments could be made by different sides that suggest the filibuster's worth or lack thereof to democracy, everyone can surely agree that it is problematic to American democracy that it's used by both parties to cynically block legislation. So with that said, are there calls to reform? Well, yeah, there are, but it's quite complicated. How would such reforms take place, and how would they go down? Just a hint, they wouldn't go down well. First, it should be said that until about 2013, it wasn't just legislation that was getting filibustered. Harry Reid, Democratic Senate Majority Leader, ended up filibustering the executive and judicial nominations that year. And 4 years later, in 2017, Mitch McConnell and the GOP did their bit by ending the filibuster on Supreme Court nominations. Just a simple majority was needed to change these rules, but in both cases, it was very controversial. The first case was seen by the Republicans as an abuse of power, and the second case, well, it was perceived as revenge. Eliminating the legislative aspect of the filibuster would too only take a majority, but once again, it would be seriously controversial. Some Democrats still want to do it, but Mitch McConnell has said that it would lead to a scorched earth Senate if Chuck Schumer and co. went ahead with it. What does he mean by scorched earth? Well, in a speech in the Senate Minority Leader suggested that, quote, the most mundane tasks would actually be harder. It would be like a, quote, 100-car pile-up. And once back in power, the pendulum would, quote, swing hard to conservative policies, just as it's doing towards liberal agendas in the current Congress. To a degree, though, this is a pointless conversation. As the genuine removal for the filibuster, there's simply not enough support. At least 2 Democrats, Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, are not in favour of such a change. However, there are ways around this. Could there be smaller scale changes that the Democrats could pursue without getting rid of the whole thing? Well, let's start off with the simple stuff. One thing that's being called for, including by Joe Biden, who's generally been pretty coy on the whole controversy, is for the return of the old school filibuster, which would actually require senators to turn up, speak, and put effort into stopping bills from passing, in contrast to the current paper filibuster, where all they have to do is say they oppose something. And this has been suggested and supported by some conservatives too. But what about a compromise, in order to preserve the intended deliberative function of the Senate? Those who oppose the removal of the filibuster often use this as an argument, fearing that bad legislation will make it through without any structured debate. For this, it's been suggested by ex-Senator Tom Harkin that they could keep deliberation but allow the majority to get on with governing by scaling down the number of votes needed for a cloture as the debate progresses. Another key argument of those opposed to removing the filibuster is that it prevents the tyranny of the majority. A very fair point, and actually a crucial aspect of democracy. But others simply argue that the filibuster upholds the tyranny of the minority. They say, how fair is it that 41 senators can easily stifle what the electorate voted for? To tackle this, Norm Ornstein, an expert on the workings of Congress, has proposed a reversal of the filibuster. Basically, under this system, you'd need 40 senators to say that they want to keep debating, tying to the talking filibuster. In fact, journalist Ezra Klein has called this an endurance test for senators. A final proposal would be to change a certain senatorial rule to allow more things to be classified under reconciliation, although this would just keep going until it effectively wiped out the filibuster. Of course, all of this comes down to whether you think it's an issue. To proponents of reform, who, it should be said, strangely change depending on whoever's in power, the filibuster prevents important legislation from passing and gives the minority undue power. Oh, and it was never in the Constitution, and has a seriously racially charged background. But getting rid of the filibuster could in itself cause problems. It's thought of by some as a tradition of American democracy. Plus, removing it could lead to a lack of debate, shoddy legislation, and a tyranny of the majority, causing ever more partisanship and polarization. But what do you think? Should it be done away with? Is there a better way of doing things? Or is it needed to uphold democratic values? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that's in the description.